Welcome back to this new video and ReFramework tutorial. In the last video I talked about the first state, initialization. In this video I will talk about the second state, GetTransactionData. First I will talk about the variables and workflows, which are used in this state, then I will go through the different activities within this state. Let's go. Here are all variables in the main workflow of ReFramework. As mentioned in the last video, we use these two variables in the first state, but we also use them later in the other states. And in this state we use these variables. Let's talk about each variable here. The first one is transaction item. It's of type 𝗓_item. We use this variable for the transaction items, which are stored in the queue in Orchestrator, and we want to process in the project. It means that we get each 𝗓_item from the queue, and store it in this variable. Using this variable we can later read the data, which we stored for the 𝗓_item. And we can set the item as successful or failed, depending on the execution of this item. If the execution is successfully, we set the item as successful. If the execution is failed because of an exception, we set the item as failed. Or we can also set other statuses for the item. So what you have to know about this variable is, that we use it to communicate with Orchestrator queue. This means that you don't need this variable, in case you don't use a queue in the process. That's all about this variable. The next variable is transaction number. This variable can be used to number the items, so that we know we are working with the first item, second item, third item, etc. And we can use it then to set a condition, for example to stop a process after processing 10 items. Or maybe we can use it for reporting purposes or for something else. But it's an optional variable, which we don't have to use. The next variable is transaction data. It's of type data table. We can use this variable, if the data are not stored in a queue, but in an Excel file for example. So we store all items in this variable, then we can go through the rows in this data table, which have to be executed in the project. We can use this variable, in case we don't use a queue in the process, but we get the data from another source. It means that we either use this variable, or we use the first variable, transaction item. It depends on your project, if you have a queue or not. We don't use both variables together. The next variable is transaction ID. As the name suggests, we use it as unique value, to differentiate between the transaction items. It can be used for reporting purposes. We mostly set the value for this variable as the current time, but we can use other values, like invoice number or order number, etc. If you use a queue in the process, you don't really need this variable, because you can use the queue item reference as ID. And the last two variables are, TransactionField and TransactionField. We use these two variables to store data from the transaction item. It means that we read specific data from the transaction item, and store them in these two variables. For example, if we want to process invoices in the project, we save the data from the invoice in the transaction item, like invoice number, date, amount, currency, etc. From this transaction item we can then store specific data in these two variables, for example invoice number and invoice date. But we can use these variables also to store something else, which is in relation with the transaction item. You can also use only one variable from these two variables, or you can also add new variables if you need to store more information. If you are using a queue in your project, I recommend you to not use these two variables, if you want to store data from the transaction item, because you already have the data in the transaction item, and you can get the data later in the process, once you need it. But if you use these two variables to store something else, what you don't have in the transaction item directly, then you can use these variables. Let's see how to read data from transaction item, to store them in these two variables, or to use the data in the process. Assume we stored the item in variable transaction item. We use first this variable, then we use the function specific content. After that we set the name we want to select in brackets, for example invoice number. At the end we set to string function. The statement looks like this one for invoice number. Or for invoice date so. Or currency. And so on. We can read the data we stored in the transaction item. Let's now try to split these variables in two categories, depending on the project. Either we have a project using a queue. In this queue we have the queue items, which we created using data from a source, like Excel, database, web page, etc. Or we have a project, which doesn't use a queue. So the items here comes directly from the source, like reading a row from Excel file, or getting data using API, or something else. So we have these two categories, either with queue or without queue. Let's first see the first category, project with queue. In this case we need the variable, transaction item, to store the queue items from Orchestrator. We could use the transaction ID, if we want to set an ID for the item, which is not stored in the transaction item. But if the ID is already stored in transaction item, then we don't need this variable. TransactionField 1 and TransactionField 2 can be also used here, if we want to store data, which is not stored in transaction item. But if you want to use these two variables to store data, which is already stored in transaction item, then it's better to not use these variables. Transaction number can also be used in this project category, if you want to set a condition using this variable, or to get the count of the transaction items, or to do something else with this variable. But if you don't need to do anything from these points, then you don't need this variable also. In summary, only the first variable is mandatory, but the other variables are optional. That's all about the variables for the first category. Let's now see the variables for the second category. As mentioned, we don't use a queue in this category, which means that we get the queue items directly from the source. The items are not really queue items, but items which should be processed in the project. The source could be Excel, database, web page or something else. To store the items we use the variable, TransactionData. In ReFramework is the variable of type data table. But you can change the variable type, depending on the data which you have. For example, if the items are rows from an Excel file, you can use data table type. But if you get the items from a web page using an API, you might need a JSON variable. And so on, you can change the type depending on the data. The other variables can be also used the same as in the first category to store the data. And here is also only the first variable is mandatory, but the other variables are optional. That's all about the variables in ReFramework, which we use in the second state. We also use these variables later in the next states, but the first use for these variables in the second state, therefore I talked about them in this video. Let's now move on to the workflows, which are used in the second state. We have 8 standard workflows in ReFramework. These 3 workflows are used in the first state, as I mentioned in the previous video. In the second state we only use one workflow, GetTransactionData. So the name of the workflow is the same as the name of the state. As the name suggests, we use this workflow to get the data, which we want to process. If we use a queue, we get the queue items in this workflow from Orchestrator. But if we don't have a queue and the items comes directly from the source, we get them in this workflow. In summary, we use this workflow to get the transaction items, regardless where the items are picked up from. I will talk about this workflow in details later in the video. So these were the variables and workflows, which we use in the second state in ReFramework. Let's now see the different activities in this state and learn more about them. I have here the process in UiPath. Here is the second state, what I am talking about in this video. We have here the first state, initialization. If this state is successfully executed, we move on to the second state, GetTransactionData. Let's see this state. We have only one sequence in the entry section. In this sequence we have first an activity to check if there is a stop request from Orchestrator. It means, we check here if someone requested a stop for the process in Orchestrator. This can be done using this option in Orchestrator for the running jobs. The result of this activity will be saved in this variable, should_stop. It's of type Boolean. So if stop is requested, the variable value is true. In this case we go through then option in the if activity. Here we only have 2 activities. The first one is log message. And then we set the variable transaction item equal to nothing. It means, we didn't get any transaction item from the queue. But if nobody requested stop, the variable value is false. In this case we go through else option in the if activity. Here we have a try catch activity. In this activity we invoke the workflow, GetTransactionData. Let's see the arguments of this workflow. As you see, we use all variables, what I talked about before. And we also use the config variable, which we got from the first state, initialization. Why we also use this variable here, we will see in a moment within this workflow. So let's open the workflow to see what we do there. In this workflow we have first the activity, GetTransactionItem. We use it to pick up a transaction item from the queue in Orchestrator. For this activity we use 2 parameters. The first one is the TransactionItem argument, to store the picked queue item in it. And we have to define, where is the queue item stored? I mean in which queue? For this we use the queue name, which we stored in the config file. Therefore we use the variable config of type dictionary, to get the queue name. In this way we pick up a transaction item from the queue. If we want to pick up a specific transaction item, we can use the reference. But for ReFramework we don't need it, because we want to get all queue items, one by one. Therefore the reference is empty in this case. After that we check, if we got a transaction item or not. If we got one, we calculate the following variables. The values here are the default values, but we can change them as we like. For the ID we set for example the current time. For the field variables we set an empty string. Assume we have invoices in the transaction items. And we also have the following data in each transaction item: invoice number, invoice date, and invoice amount. We can change the values for these three variables as follows. We set the ID equal to the invoice number, the field 1 equal to the invoice date, and the field 2 equal to the invoice amount. But as already mentioned, we don't need to do that, because we can read this data later in the process. But if you want to add log fields to your process, and you want to use this information in the process, then you can use these variables. That's all about this workflow. After executing this workflow, we go back to the second state. So we were in a try-catch activity. If an exception occurs in the workflow, we move on to catch section. Here we have a log message and an assign activity. Here we also set the transaction item equal to nothing, because we got an exception in this case. And in finally section we don't have any activities. That's all about the activities in the second state. In this state we have two transitions, to move on to another state in ReFramework. The first one is new transaction, which means that we got a transaction item from the queue. In this case we move on to the next state, process transaction. And the second transition is no data, which means that we didn't got any transaction item. In this case we move on to the state, end process. Let's see the conditions of these two transitions. The condition for the first transition is, if the transaction item variable is not nothing. It means we got a transaction item. We have a log message here. As you see we have the destination state, process transaction. And the condition of the second transition is, if the transaction item is nothing. In this case we don't have a transaction item. We also have here a log message. The destination here is the state, end process. So after executing this state, we either move on the state, process transaction, in case we have a transaction item. Or we move on to the state, end process, in case we don't get a transaction item. Assume we got a transaction item. In this case we move on to process transaction. From this state we have three transitions. The first one is success, which means that everything is done correctly. In this case we go back again to the second state to get the next transaction item. The second transition is business exception, which means that we had a business exception in the third state. In this case we move on also to the second state to get the next transaction item. But in case we had a system exception in the third state, we go back to the first state. After executing the first state, if everything is done successfully, we go ahead to the second state, to get the next transaction item. So we do these steps, until all transaction items are picked up and processed. I mean until we don't have any transaction items in the queue. In this case we go to the last state, end process. That's all about the second state and the relation between it and the other states in ReFramework. I hope you could learn more about the second state in this video. In the next video I will go ahead with the next state, process transaction. And don't worry, after explaining all states in ReFramework I will explain some use cases using ReFramework template. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to write us. Have a nice day and see you in the next video.